has now warned of a creeping danger, the Al-Qaeda. How big a threat does it pose in India? It's worth dwelling on its record for this. Al-Qaeda's most spectacular moment when it hijacked passenger aircraft were flown into the World Trade Center in New York. Since then, the Al-Qaeda has lost a slew of leaders, including its head Osama bin Laden, killed in the Pakistani city of Abbottabad in May 2011. Al-Qaeda appears to have gone under the radar after that strike. More so, given the rise of the Islamic State and its brutalities. It's not even clear where its current leader, the Egyptian doctor Ayman al-Zawahiri, is, although some reports have indicated Karachi. But counter-terrorism officials in Washington, D.C. were informed during a briefing on Thursday that the movement is very much alive and kicking and could well return in a more localized, less overtly aggressive form, but with the same agenda, a world ruled by Islamic law or Sharia. The briefing was by Catherine Zimmerman, an Al-Qaeda specialist of the American Enterprise Institute, and a message was succinct, that with America focused on the Islamic State, the new Al-Qaeda could emerge. Al-Qaeda has adapted, she said, and evolved. It is more resilient, but acting below the radar. This is to avoid drawing attention to itself. It has embedded itself in a maze of local insurgencies. These insurgencies range from Mali to Afghanistan. Zimmerman argues that Al-Qaeda sees as its priority Muslim countries. It aims to unify Muslims all over the world while avoiding the imposition of hardline ideas and attitudes so as not to alienate the local population. The new thinking within the Al-Qaeda is that Muslims still need to be guided towards gradual elimination of the nation state which keeps them divided. Zimmerman believes that with the collapse of 5 Muslim states since 2011, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya and Mali, the weakening of strong states like Egypt, Sunni Muslims in many parts of the world are feeling insecure and vulnerable. Her final argument is this: as the Islamic State collapses, its remnants are expected to seek service with Al-Qaeda. There is no ideological difference between the two, so Al-Qaeda can use them to build its expertise for the long battle ahead. The million-dollar question now: how will this affect India? Evidence of Al-Qaeda presence in this country has always been thin, but a reported 80 Indian nationals have contacted the Islamic State. Some of them have gone to the killing grounds of Syria and Iraq, and others to Afghanistan. One can assume that some of them could gravitate towards the Al-Qaeda, which is there in Afghanistan, although weakened now. It is also there in Pakistan, and there are Al-Qaeda affiliates in the form of the Taliban and the Tehreek-e-Taliban, the Lashkar-e-Toiba. The briefing to US counter-terror officials also underscores this point, that the Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent cannot be sneezed at, since it includes every one of the groups mentioned here. Joining us this evening, retired Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director of the Society for Policy Studies. He's a well-known defense expert. Good evening, sir. My first question to you is what we said was a million-dollar question. How serious, how big a threat does the Al-Qaeda in its current form pose in India?
I would describe this as a serious challenge to India at this point in time. Because as you pointed out, the Al-Qaeda came onto the global radar actually in the early 90s when we had the first term of US President Bill Clinton, and there was an attack carried out on US embassies in Africa, East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and we also had an attack on a US naval ship, the USS Cole. So we're talking about the mid-90s. Of course, we had the spectacular attack of 2001, September of that particular year, when the Twin Towers were attacked. From then to now, I think the Al-Qaeda has gone through various ups and downs in its own leadership. Bin Laden is a good example. But the ideology of the group and the objective to establish the equivalent of a caliphate which is governed or administered by the Sharia, that has not diminished. And my own reading is that in the last few weeks and months, literally, when the US-led global attention was on the Islamic State and the fall of Mosul, which happened as recently as a week, 10 days ago, is indicative of an Islamic State that is now scattered in terms of its leadership and its cadres. And it's in this interim, when the global focus was on the Islamic State, that the Al-Qaeda was regrouping and consolidating. And for them, South Asia, differently referred to as Khorasan, has been a long-term objective. They are now dominant in different parts of South Asia, including India, which is why I would like to characterize this as a serious threat that needs to be monitored.
Do you believe that the Islamic State's loss of stature elsewhere in the world is also translating into a new lease of life for the Al-Qaeda also here in India, taking forward from what you said?
Well, I would say that across the board, the way in which the Islamic State has now, in a way, been, as I said, forced to flee from its traditional strongholds, both in Iraq and in Syria, has led to a certain, I would say, ascendancy, if you will, of the Al-Qaeda as an entity. Because for the last 6 or 7 years, there's been this tension, particularly after Bin Laden and Abbottabad, wherein the Islamic State tried to project itself as the more vibrant and the more effective as far as the objective and the ideology was concerned. And the Al-Qaeda also had certain reservations about the kind of violence that the Islamic State was actually supporting, including the beheadings. If you look at their propaganda outlets and the kind of discourses that they have brought into the public domain, Zawahiri, after Bin Laden's demise, or Bin Laden being removed, actually cautioned the Islamic State, saying that this kind of killing of other Muslims, meaning the sectarian part, was not desirable. That is when you see Baghdadi actually deciding that he is going to branch out on his own, and he declares himself as the Caliph, the supreme leader as far as the entire spectrum is concerned in terms of those who subscribe to this particular ideology and the objective of the Sharia. So in a very brief way, I would say that when we had the setback in Mosul and the pressure in Syria, it is the Al-Qaeda that has emerged as the more potent. And I think their current investment from Afghanistan, Pakistan, perhaps in some clusters in India, and particularly Bangladesh, is something that should concern the professionals about their ability to be activated if such an occasion does arise. And this fits in with the larger pattern, Palki, if I may, about the lone wolf operations, small groups operating and carrying out various types of destruction and death. And I think we need to be very, very alert to these possibilities, which is why I would say it's a serious challenge. And there is no need for panic or alarm, but a sense that the lights are slowly turning amber. That's how I would describe it. Palki?
So while we've been talking about the potential threat to India for years, Commodore Bhaskar, what I fail to understand is that while there is evidence linking ISIS to India, there is none linking Al-Qaeda to India. Have they not been successful in making inroads, or are they moving with so much precision and so cleverly that they've avoided detection?
Well, I would say that, for a long time, this has been, I think, one of the assertions in India that the Al-Qaeda has not found any support. But what I'm trying to suggest is that whether we talk about the Islamic State, the Daesh, or the Al-Qaeda, or local groups, whether you talk about the Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Tehreek-e-Taliban and other affiliates or groups in Bangladesh, there is a core, I would say, correspondence in the ideology. That is the commitment to the Sharia. And that there is, at some point in the distant future, the emergence of the caliphate even in South Asia, which, as I said, is a reference to Khorasan. Now, the reason why I think this particular branding of the Al-Qaeda, whenever people have been apprehended, they have seemed to be affiliated with other groups. The Al-Qaeda itself has not come up. But I would only make the case that this is really a case of how affiliations are sought or established in different points in time. If one looks at this in terms of the nature of the security challenge to India, it is the ideology. The name itself doesn't matter, whether they're going to call themselves the Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And you will recall that over the last couple of years, we have had certain individuals, occasionally a group, claiming a certain allegiance either to the Islamic State, or perhaps we haven't seen this happening in the public domain, but definitely in Bangladesh, there are groups that talk about an allegiance to the Al-Qaeda in South Asia. So this has been, I think, recorded, but we should, I think, be alert to the possibility that the new confidence in the Al-Qaeda, and they have their own propaganda machinery, would become more active. And whenever one talks about the success of the propaganda campaign, I often draw attention to what happened in Singapore a couple of months ago, where again, you'll recall, there was this 22-year-old young lady who, working in Singapore as a professional, was, in a way, motivated by the propaganda of the Islamic State, and she was apprehended at the airport. So this is the reach. And whether you pick up 1, 2, 5, 10, I think these small numbers have the ability, I think, to challenge or pose a danger to civil society, if not to the state.
My final question to you, Commodore Bhaskar, is that is the Indian security apparatus prepared to deal with this emerging challenge, according to you?
My reading is that, they are very alert to this, but we have a lot of capacity building to do. And I say this with some dismay that Mumbai happened 9 years ago. If you use that as a benchmark and look at the kind of recommendations that had been made for enhancing India's overall capacity, both at the level of the center and the individual states, particularly those that are prone to such violence or such terrorism, the ability to enhance the capacity even in terms of information gathering, converting that into some kind of intelligence, arriving at long-term trends, and actually coming up with actionable intelligence, which is the real challenge in any such operation. My reading, and I say this with some regret, is below the median. And I think, we have not been able to pull all the strands together. We are still talking about center-state dissonance. We have not been able to get the intelligence information into the kind of high levels of efficiency that we need. So I think while there may be an awareness, the ability to actually build capacity in an effective manner where you can preempt, which is the real challenge. That, I would say, is perhaps there are some gaps that we need to address. Palki?
Right. Commodore Bhaskar, as always, pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Gravitas. We're going to take a break at this point. Still ahead on the show, we head to Mosul, the latest on the search for the 39 abducted Indians. Stay with us for ground reports.